The Ardennes, December 1944. Just after 0400 hours, a pervasive, thick fog descended, obscuring the dense pine forests and the snow-dusted ravines, providing an unexpected shroud for the German offensive that was about to shatter the perceived stalemate of the Western Front. This audacious thrust, known later as the Battle of the Bulge, hinged on the belief that the Allied lines, though extended, were brittle, and that a swift, decisive breakthrough could split their forces and seize vital supply depots. German high command had for months consistently broadcast confidence in the impregnability of their defensive structures, particularly the Siegfried Line, a vast network of bunkers, dragon's teeth, and anti-tank ditches that stretched for hundreds of miles, a testament to years of meticulous engineering and strategic placement. The prevailing narrative among German field commanders was that these fortifications, coupled with the anticipated winter weather, rendered any significant Allied armored advance impossible. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, had personally overseen numerous reinforcement efforts, ensuring that key sectors were bristling with anti-tank guns and camouflaged strongpoints. His staff meticulously charted kill zones and overlapping fields of fire, convinced that any attacking force would be funneled into a meat grinder of pre-registered artillery and machine gun fire. This confidence was not merely propaganda. It stemmed from a deep-seated belief in the superior design and strategic depth of their defenses, a conviction that would soon be tested by the unexpected resilience of the American armored divisions. The Siegfried Line, often referred to by the Germans as the West Wall, represented a monumental undertaking of defensive architecture initiated in the late 1930s. Construction records indicate that by 1940, over 14,000 bunkers and pillboxes had been completed, requiring millions of tons of concrete and steel. These structures varied in complexity from simple machine gun emplacements to multi-story command bunkers, all designed to withstand sustained artillery bombardment. The dragon's teeth, pyramidal concrete obstacles, arranged in staggered rows, were particularly effective at channeling tanks into predetermined killing zones, their angled faces designed to deflect tank tracks and expose vulnerable underbellies. The strategic doctrine behind the West Wall emphasized defense in depth, with multiple layers of fortifications designed to absorb and attrition an attacking force. German military handbooks detailed protocols for counterattacks from concealed positions, aiming to envelop and destroy any penetrations. Production logs from Krupp and Rheinmetall confirm a steady supply of Pak-40 anti-tank guns, with over 23,000 units manufactured by 1944, many of which were integrated into these defensive lines or held in reserve for rapid deployment. The sheer scale and density of these defenses fostered a pervasive sense of security among the German forces, a belief that their lines were indeed unbreakable. This conviction was reinforced by the early Allied attempts to breach sections of the West Wall, which often resulted in heavy casualties and limited gains. Unit diaries from American infantry divisions frequently described the demoralizing effect of encountering seemingly endless rows of concrete and steel, often under intense fire. The psychological impact of these formidable barriers was as significant as their physical strength, contributing to the perception of an insurmountable obstacle. The German High Command, observing these early struggles, saw confirmation of their defensive prowess, overlooking the growing adaptability and evolving tactics of their adversaries. The meticulous planning and construction of the Siegfried Line, combined with the harsh winter conditions, presented a formidable challenge that many German officers believed would hold indefinitely. A had built a fortress, not just of concrete and steel, but of strategic certainty, a certainty that would soon face a rude awakening. The Ardennes, November 1944. The ground, still soft from autumn rains, began to harden with the encroaching winter, a change that would soon present its own set of challenges for any large-scale movement. Allied intelligence, piecing together aerial reconnaissance and intercepted radio traffic, noted a discernible shift in German defensive posture, a hardening of lines that suggested a belief in their own immutability. Yet, beneath this perceived German confidence, the American First Army, specifically its 8th Corps, was preparing for a different kind of reality. This sector, stretching over 80 miles, was considered a quiet front, an area where battered divisions could rest and new recruits could gain experience. German commanders, relying on the dense forests and broken terrain, had thinly spread their forces, believing the natural obstacles alone provided sufficient defense. They had, in essence, created a psychological fortress, an unbreakable line, born more of assumption than of robust engineering or overwhelming troop concentrations. American logistical efforts, however, were steadily building a counterpoint to this German complacency. From the port of Antwerp, a steady flow of materiel moved eastward, filling vast supply dumps behind the lines. Quartermaster reports from late October indicated an average daily delivery of 60,000 tons of supplies across all Allied fronts, a logistical marvel that dwarfed anything the Germans could sustain. This included thousands of gallons of high-octane fuel, mountains of ammunition, and critically, a growing inventory of armored vehicles. The M4 Sherman tank, the workhorse of the Allied armored forces, was arriving in increasing numbers. Production logs from Detroit factories showed an output rate of approximately 1,500 units per month by late 1944, a relentless churn that allowed for constant replacement and reinforcement. While often outgunned by the heavier German Panthers and Tigers in direct engagements, the Sherman's numerical superiority and mechanical reliability presented a different kind of threat. Its 75mm and later 76mm guns, though sometimes struggling against frontal German armor, were lethal against infantry and lighter fortifications. And its speed and maneuverability were often underestimated. The American strategy was not predicated on individual tank duels, but on overwhelming force and relentless pressure. The buildup was not merely about numbers. It was about creating a flexible, mobile spearhead capable of exploiting any weakness. Engineer battalions, working around the clock, improved existing roads and constructed new ones, ensuring that the logistical tail could keep pace with any advance. The objective was to create a flow, an unstoppable tide that would simply bypass or overwhelm the static German defenses. This quiet accumulation of power, hidden beneath the canopy of the Ardennes, represented a stark contrast to the German perception of their own invulnerability. While German communiques spoke of fortified positions and unyielding resistance, the reality on the ground was a thin crust of defense facing an ever-deepening reservoir of Allied offensive capability. The stage was being set for a confrontation where perceived strength would meet actual, tangible force. Ardennes, December 1944. The dense, cloying fog, a meteorological gift from the heavens for the German High Command, began to lift in isolated patches, revealing the skeletal trees and snow-dusted ground. This unexpected atmospheric shield had been instrumental in the initial success of the Ardennes Offensive, allowing panzer divisions to surge forward largely unmolested by Allied air superiority. German intelligence estimates, based on reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations, had confidently predicted a slow, methodical Allied response, underestimating the speed with which American units could redeploy and engage. The early hours of the offensive had seen a rapid collapse of thinly spread American lines, particularly around the Schnee Eifel, where the 106th Infantry Division found itself encircled. The German strategy, codified in Operation Wacht am Rhein, hinged on speed and the exploitation of the element of surprise, aiming to seize Antwerp and split the Allied forces. Their logistical projections, however, were predicated on capturing Allied fuel depots, a critical vulnerability that would soon manifest as a choke point for their armored spearheads. the initial thrust of the 5th Panzer Army, under General Hasso von Manteuffel, pushed through the Losheim Gap, encountering pockets of determined but ultimately overwhelmed American resistance. German unit diaries from December 17th record engagements where Panther tanks, with their formidable 7.5 cm KWK-42 L-70 guns, systematically dismantled American M4 Shermans, often at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun, while effective against earlier German armor, struggled to penetrate the Panther's glacis plate at typical combat distances. Damage reports from the American 7th Armored Division for the first 3 days of the offensive reveal a disproportionate loss ratio, with numerous M4A3E2 jumbo Shermans, designed with thicker frontal armor, still falling victim to concentrated fire from German heavy tanks and anti-tank guns. The German 8.8 cm PaK-43, often deployed in ambush positions along key roads, proved particularly devastating, capable of penetrating the Sherman's frontal armor from over 2,000 meters. The psychological impact on American tank crews facing an adversary with superior firepower and often concealed positions was profound. The German armored columns, particularly those of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, advanced along the northern shoulder. Their progress marked by a trail of wrecked American vehicles and scattered equipment. The sheer weight of their initial assault, comprising over 200,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, created a salient that stretched deep into the Allied lines. This penetration, while tactically impressive, also lengthened their supply lines and increased their dependence on a dwindling fuel reserve. The German operational doctrine, emphasizing rapid maneuver and encirclement, had been honed on the Eastern Front, but the terrain and road network of the Ardennes presented different challenges. The narrow, winding roads channeled their forces, making them vulnerable to ambushes and slowing their overall pace. Production logs from the Reichsministerium für Rüstung und Kriegsproduktion showed a monthly output of approximately 300 Panther tanks and 150 Tiger II tanks by late 1944, a formidable, though ultimately unsustainable rate, given the attrition of the Eastern and Western fronts combined. Yet, despite these initial tactical successes, the deeper strategic objectives remained elusive. The American defenders, though initially surprised, began to coalesce, forming ad hoc defensive lines and delaying actions that bought precious time. The German High Command's overconfidence in the speed of their advance, coupled with a fundamental underestimation of American logistical resilience, would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. The fog, which had cloaked their initial surge, could not obscure the growing logistical nightmare that was slowly engulfing their armored divisions. The Ardennes, December 1944. General Hasso von Manteuffel surveyed the preparations for the offensive, a vast array of men and machines gathering under the cloak of winter. His 5th Panzer Army, alongside Brandenburger's 7th, formed the spearhead of a desperate gambit to reverse the tide of war. Intelligence reports from the preceding months, compiled from aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations, had consistently underestimated the American capacity for rapid deployment and the resilience of their logistical networks. The German High Command, however, remained largely convinced of the inherent superiority of their defensive positions and the qualitative edge of their armored divisions. The Siegfried Line, or West Wall, as the Germans termed it, was a formidable series of fortifications stretching over 630 kilometers. Constructed primarily between 1936 and 1939, it comprised over 18,000 bunkers, tunnels, and tank traps. Its concrete walls, often reinforced with steel and reaching thicknesses of 3.5 meters in critical sectors, were designed to withstand sustained artillery bombardment. Anti-tank obstacles, known as Hochrelinien or Dragon's Teeth, were specifically engineered to impede the advance of Allied armor, presenting a staggered, multi-layered barrier that required specialized demolition teams to breach. The German commanders, steeped in the doctrine of static defense when the tactical situation demanded, viewed these defenses as nearly impregnable. Their confidence was not entirely unfounded, drawing from the demonstrated resilience of similar fortifications on the Eastern Front, where Soviet offensives had often bogged down in the face of prepared defenses. The Panther tank, with its 7.5-centimeter KWK 42L70 gun, could engage most Allied tanks at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, often penetrating their frontal armor. The Tiger I, though fewer in number, possessed the even more potent 8.8-centimeter KWK 36L56 gun, capable of defeating any Allied tank at comparable distances. Production logs from November 1944 showed 375 operational Panthers and 125 Tiger I tanks available for the Western Front, a potent force in the hands of experienced crews. Field Marshal Walther Model, commander of Army Group B, articulated this sentiment in a staff meeting just days before the offensive, stating, "The American lines are brittle." This assessment was based on observations of American tactical doctrine, which often emphasized mobility and offensive thrusts over entrenched static defense. German intelligence believed that the American logistical tail, while robust, was also vulnerable to disruption, and that their relatively green troops would falter under a concentrated surprise assault. The dense forests and rugged terrain of the Ardennes were also seen as an advantage, limiting Allied air superiority and channeling their armored movements into predictable corridors, ripe for ambush. The German plan, Wacht am Rhein, hinged on precisely these assumptions, a swift, decisive breakthrough that would exploit perceived weaknesses in the American lines and capture the port of Antwerp. The early morning fog, a crucial element of the meteorological forecast, was anticipated to neutralize Allied air power, allowing German armor to advance unmolested. The initial hours of the offensive, therefore, were critical for establishing a foothold and shattering the American front before they could react effectively. The sheer audacity of the plan, coupled with the belief in the impregnability of their own defenses once the counteroffensive had run its course, fueled a dangerous overconfidence. The hedgerows of Normandy, June 1944. The dense, ancient network of earthen banks and tangled roots, often 5 feet high and topped with thick foliage, had become a formidable defensive lattice. German commanders, seasoned by years of combat on the Eastern Front, had quickly adapted their tactics, transforming each field into a miniature fortress, a series of interlocking kill zones that bled the Allied advance. Their 7.5-centimeter PaK-40 anti-tank guns, often concealed with meticulous care, dominated the narrow lanes and open fields, their high-velocity rounds capable of piercing the frontal armor of most Allied tanks at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The American M4 Sherman, the spearhead of the Allied armored thrust, entered this unforgiving landscape. Its design, a balance of mobility, firepower, and protection, reflected the American industrial ethos of mass production and tactical flexibility. The tank weighed approximately 30 tons, powered by a radial aircraft engine that delivered around 400 horsepower, allowing for a top road speed of 30 miles per hour. Its main armament, the 75mm M3 gun, was a versatile weapon, capable of firing both high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds. Though its penetration capabilities against the heavier German tanks were often found wanting. The armor, a maximum of 63mm on the glacis plate, was sloped to improve ballistic protection, yet it remained vulnerable to the more powerful German anti-tank weaponry. Initial engagements proved costly. German after-action reports from mid-June, detailing encounters in the vicinity of Carentan, consistently noted the Sherman's vulnerability. One report, dated June 18th, described 4 M4 tanks destroyed by direct hits from PaK-40s at ranges under 800 meters. with particular emphasis on penetrations through the turret front and hull sides. The Sherman's high silhouette also presented an easier target compared to the lower-profiled German panzers. The dense bocage negated much of the Sherman's speed advantage, forcing it into close-quarters engagements where its armor and gun were often outmatched. The American tankers, however, were not without ingenuity. Faced with the immediate tactical problem of breaching hedgerows without exposing their vulnerable undersides, field modifications began to appear. One notable innovation, the Rhino device, involved welding steel teeth or tusks, often fabricated from salvaged German anti-tank obstacles, to the front of the Sherman's hull. This crude but effective modification allowed tanks to plow through the hedgerows, creating their own paths rather than being funneled into pre-sighted German killing fields. This adaptation, born of necessity, began to shift the tactical balance, allowing for greater maneuverability across the difficult terrain. The strategic implications of these localized adaptations were profound. While individual Sherman tanks still faced significant threats from German anti-tank defenses, the ability to bypass established choke points disrupted the meticulously prepared German defensive lines. The sheer volume of Sherman tanks produced, over 49,000 across all variants, meant that losses, while painful, did not cripple the overall advance. For every Sherman lost, several more were available to press the attack. This quantitative superiority, combined with the emerging tactical innovations, began to erode the German confidence in their unbreakable positions. The fog of war, both literal and metaphorical, began to lift, revealing the cracks in the German resolve. The German panzer divisions, though formidable in their individual armored components, often found themselves operating within a strategic framework that prioritized, concentrated, decisive engagements. Their heavy tanks, the Tigers and Panthers, represented the pinnacle of armored design in many respects, boasting superior frontal armor and main armament that could engage Allied tanks at considerable ranges with devastating effect. The Panther's 7.5 centimeter KWK 42 L70 gun, for instance, could penetrate 120 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters, a capability that often outmatched the Sherman's 75 millimeter M3 gun, which struggled against the Panther's sloped glacis plate at similar distances. However, the sheer production volume of the American M4 Sherman tank began to exert an undeniable pressure on these German tactical advantages. By the end of 1944, American factories had delivered over 30,000 Shermans, a rate that dwarfed German heavy tank production, which saw only 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers across the entire war. This numerical disparity meant that for every Panther or Tiger, there were often 5 or more Shermans, a ratio that allowed for tactical flexibility and attrition-based engagements that the Germans could ill afford. Unit strength reports from the Ardennes Offensive, for example, frequently show German tank companies operating at 50 to 70% of their authorized strength, while Allied units, though suffering losses, were more consistently replenished. The Sherman's comparative nimbleness, with a top speed of 48 km per hour on roads, often allowed it to outmaneuver the heavier German tanks, which, despite their power, were slower and more prone to mechanical breakdown, particularly when operating off-road or during rapid advances. The Tiger I, weighing 56 tons, exerted a ground pressure of 1.05 kilograms per centimeter, significantly higher than the Sherman's 0.84 kilograms per centimeter squared, making it more susceptible to bogging down in soft terrain and placing greater stress on its complex suspension system. Field maintenance logs frequently recorded final drive and transmission failures for German heavy tanks, issues that often required extensive recovery efforts and removed critical assets from the front lines for extended periods. This combination of numerical superiority and greater operational reliability fostered a tactical shift among Allied forces, moving away from direct one-on-one tank engagements and towards combined arms tactics. Infantry, artillery, and air support were integrated with tank formations to exploit the Sherman's strengths and mitigate its individual weaknesses. A common tactic involved using infantry to suppress anti-tank gun positions, while Shermans, often operating in groups, would flank heavier German tanks or overwhelm them through sheer volume of fire, even if individual rounds were less effective. Artillery fire plans, based on forward observer reports, could quickly neutralize German strongpoints or disrupt their coordinated movements, creating windows of opportunity for Sherman advances. The introduction of the 76mm M1 gun on later Sherman variants, capable of penetrating 100mm of armor at 1,000 meters with HVAP rounds, further narrowed the gap in direct engagement capability, though it never fully matched the Panther's gun. More significantly, the doctrine of employing multiple Shermans against a single German heavy tank became standard practice. Damage reports from engagements in Normandy and the Ardennes frequently show German tanks disabled by multiple hits to less armored areas, the tracks, engine deck, or side armor, rather than a single frontal penetration. This approach, while costly in terms of Sherman losses, was sustainable given the vast production advantage. The German command, accustomed to the qualitative superiority of their armor, found themselves increasingly unable to dictate the terms of engagement. Their unbreakable lines, often predicated on static defenses or localized counterattacks by powerful but numerically limited tank formations, began to fray under the relentless pressure of massed, coordinated Allied assaults. The fog of war, literally and figuratively, often obscured the true scale of the Allied advance until it was too late to mount an effective, concentrated defense. The strategic initiative, once firmly held by the Wehrmacht, slowly but inexorably shifted. The cumulative effect of these penetrations began to register in the detailed reports filtering back to German high command. Interrogation files from captured officers revealed a growing apprehension, particularly regarding the unexpected resilience and numbers of the Allied armor. Initial assessments had often dismissed the Sherman as a lightweight, inferior to the Panther or Tiger in frontal engagement, a perception that held true in isolated, head-on duels where German heavy tanks often prevailed. However, the sheer volume of Sherman tanks deployed, often in concentrated formations, presented a different challenge. Production logs from American factories indicated a staggering output, with over 49,000 M4 Sherman tanks manufactured by the war's end, a figure dwarfing the approximately 6,000 Panthers and 1,350 Tigers produced by Germany. This numerical superiority allowed for tactical approaches that negated individual tank advantages, employing flanking maneuvers and overwhelming fire support. Damage reports from the front lines increasingly detailed instances where German defensive positions, previously deemed impregnable, had been outflanked or directly assaulted by these medium tanks. The Siegfried Line, a formidable network of bunkers and anti-tank obstacles, was designed to funnel attackers into killing zones, yet Sherman units, often supported by infantry and artillery, found ways to bypass or neutralize these strongpoints. The psychological impact of seeing these unbreakable lines breached, not by super-heavy tanks, but by the ubiquitous Sherman, began to erode confidence. Unit diaries from late 1944 and early 1945 frequently mention the relentless pressure exerted by Allied armor. One entry from a Panzer Grenadier regiment noted, "They come in waves, always more of them. Even when we destroy 3, 5 more appear." This perception of inexhaustible resources, coupled with the Sherman's effective, if not always decisive, combat performance, forced a reevaluation of defensive strategies. The emphasis shifted from static, linear defenses to more fluid, counter-attacking doctrines, though often with insufficient reserves to execute them effectively. The strategic implication was profound. The German war machine, built on principles of superior individual weapon quality and decisive, concentrated strikes, found itself overwhelmed by an enemy that could absorb losses and maintain relentless pressure. The boast of unbreakable lines became a hollow echo against the reality of continuous Allied penetration, each breach a small but significant step towards the inevitable collapse of the Western Front. The fog of war, once a potential ally for surprise German counteroffensives, now frequently concealed the advance of an enemy whose numbers proved to be their most potent weapon. The German offensive, launched with such initial fury, began to lose its impetus. Fuel shortages, documented in countless logistical reports, became a critical impediment. The 11th Panzer Division, for instance, reported on December 23, 1944, that its operational tanks possessed less than 20% of their required fuel reserves. This systemic deficiency, exacerbated by the relentless interdiction of Allied air power against supply convoys, meant that even successful penetrations could not be fully exploited. The persistent Allied pressure, particularly from the armored divisions, prevented the German forces from consolidating their gains. The Shermans, often operating in adverse conditions, maintained a continuous forward momentum. Unit diaries from the 4th Armored Division frequently noted engagements where American tanks, despite being outnumbered in specific locales, managed to disrupt German formations and deny them critical terrain. The sheer volume of Allied armor, detailed in production statistics showing over 49,000 M4 Shermans manufactured by the war's end, allowed for a sustained offensive posture that the German war machine, by contrast, could no longer match. The German command structure, once so confident in its unbreakable lines, found itself increasingly fragmented and reactive. Intercepted radio traffic and prisoner interrogations revealed a growing desperation among field commanders. The 5th Panzer Army, tasked with the primary thrust, reported on December 26, 1944, that its advance had stalled completely west of Bastogne, unable to overcome the entrenched American resistance and the constant threat of flanking attacks. The strategic implications of this faltering offensive were profound. The initial shock had worn off, and the Allied forces, having absorbed the initial blow, were now counterattacking with increasing vigor. The logistical strain on the German army was unsustainable, with daily consumption rates of ammunition and fuel far exceeding their dwindling production and supply capabilities. German ordnance reports from late December showed a precipitous decline in artillery shell availability,